Hey guys, Jeremy here with Simple Little Life, and this video I'm just going to show you how I made a small Tanto knife. And I guess the one big thing about this video that differentiates it from others is that I actually drew this one entirely on the computer using SketchUp. Now I have a tutorial in another video, you can check that out, and it's a pretty slick little program, and I quite enjoy working with a template. One of the big advantages is that you can simply I'll cut out the template and just use some Super 77 adhesive and glue that onto the material that I'm using. It's 1/4 inch 01 tool steel, and we're just going to glue it on there, and that gives us a place that we can cut out. And also one thing that's really handy is you can mark your holes very accurately without having to do any measurements on the steel itself. So here we're just going to cut out the blade, and this 1/4 inch, so it's fairly slow, fairly difficult to cut, but I'm going for a very simple, very clean look on this Tanto. There you have it cut out. And then we're going to kind of finish trimming it up and cleaning it up on the belt grinder. Just to get the rough profile, bring it right down to those lines that I have printed. And I'll leave the paper on for as much of this process as I can so that I know exactly where I'm working to. This horizontal belt grinder I made has really come in quite handy, and man, I really enjoy it. Looks pretty good for the rough profile. Now we're just going to mark out where we want our grind to come to for the edge of our knife. And to do that, I just use a drill bit that's the same diameter as the material thickness I'm using. And I put a little Sharpie on there just so it shows up nice. Just for curiosity's sake, I wanted to weigh the blank before I ground it and drilled the holes just so I had an idea of how much weight I actually remove while I'm making a knife. And then we get into grinding. Now, for doing my hollow grinds, I start out with a jig, and I find that really helps to get a very nice consistent angle done. And then it also depends on the day. Some days I'm great freehand, and some days it just doesn't work out very well. Some people get all hung up on whether or not you use jigs or not, and ultimately you're still grinding it by hand. It's still a handmade knife. And like I say, some days are great freehand. Some of the processes I'll get into freehand. I like to get my initial heavy bevels done with a jig, and then I'll do a lot of the stock removal and kind of clean up the top line there by hand. And then also I'll use a really fine belt, and I'll finish everything up with a jig again. It's looking pretty good there. And we're back to the jig with a much finer belt. This is a hollow grind, and I'm using a 10-inch contact wheel. Now with the Tanto knife, you want a different angle on the tip, so I am just doing a perfectly straight grind, and then we'll come in later by hand and grind the tip, and that will be a flat grind. Gives it a little bit more strength for stabbing and a little more tip strength, but you still get that really nice fine edge with a hollow grind. And it looks pretty neat when it's done as well. It's looking pretty good for before heat treat. I'll clean it up a little bit after heat treat just to make sure everything's nice and straight and crispy. And there you can see the profile of the tip that has not been ground yet. And the next step, I'm actually going to draw out where I want my tip to be ground to. I scribe those lines. I freehand the tip, freehand grind the tip, and it really helps to have some reference lines to work to, just to make sure you can get everything consistent. And it's a bit of a nerve-wracking process, you know, being all freehand and stuff. If you kind of mess it up, it's a real heartbreak, but just take our time there and get her really nice and straight and flat. One thing you'll notice is I'm holding on to the back of the platen there. I find it really helps when you're trying to steady your hands and get very consistent grinds by hand. I actually will hold on to the platen while I'm grinding. Just make sure you keep your fingers away from the wheels and the belt. So that's looking pretty good. I want a fairly thick edge on there. We'll sharpen it and put our secondary bevel on, but it's fairly consistent and even all the way along, and I think that's pretty good for grinding before a heat treat. And a lot of question I get asked is if you can grind after heat treat, and you most certainly can, but you need to just be careful that you don't overheat the blade. So if you're going to be doing grinding after heat treat, you want to be very careful to watch your heat. And here I'm just marking out the handle shape on some white G10. And then we'll cut that out. And to actually mark the holes, I did end up cutting out the template again and gluing that on as well. And so it's really nice when you don't have to go back and forth and measure for your holes and stuff like that. Really makes it quite easy. And here's the holes that we'd previously marked while our template was glued to the steel. And we'll just drill those out. Start out with a 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to enlarge those to a 1/2 inch for the tubes that I'm going to use as pins. And here's that 1/2 inch drill bit. And then I laid out a series of holes, and I kind of just marked those out that are simply to remove the weight. And I just drilled a whole bunch of 1/4 inch holes in there just to lighten up the handle, because this is 1/4 inch stock, so it's a lot of weight there, and I don't want a super heavy knife, especially with all the grinding that we did on the blade. I want to kind of balance it out a little bit better. And then I'll use one of the top wheels on my platen, and I'll do a kind of a hollow grind into the handle to further remove additional weight. There you kind of see what we're talking about. That's a way I've started to use lately to remove weight, and it's really quite effective. You just got to be careful you don't get too close to your edges there. It doesn't have to look all that pretty, but it is nice just to be able to get all that additional weight out of there and give further balance to the knife. Then we'll drill out our G10. Again, I start with a 1/4 inch hole, and then finish it up with a 1/2 inch hole for the tubes. Now let's check the weight out. So we were 143 grams after grinding, and holes are drilled, and 5.04 ounces. So you can see we started at 232 grams and 8.2 ounces. So that's quite a significant weight reduction in the blank from when we'd started. And then I'll heat treat the blade. This is a 1, so I bring it up to 1475, leave it there for 10 minutes, and then I'm quenching it in canola oil. And I'll follow that with 2 temper cycles at 450 degrees. I let it air cool in between each temper, and I leave it in there for about half an hour for each cycle. It all varies depending on the thickness and stuff, and with the blade being quite thin, I kind of treat that as my dimension that I heat treat to. But you also want to make sure you get the whole thing so it's not brittle and stuff. And now we're just going to clean it up with a Scotch Brite pad, a surface conditioning belt. Get all the scale off of there and kind of get it ready for glue up. And even after the surface conditioning pad, I will go over it with some sandpaper. And I'll take most of the blade and stuff right up to about 400 grit. And I leave the bevels at what happens, whatever finish I get with the surface conditioning pad. I don't hand finish my hollow grind bevels. I just find it's so much work, and I get a good result with the surface conditioning belt, so I don't touch those after I'm done with them on the surface conditioning pad.
Next shop class, can you sharpen them?
And now we're ready for glue up, so I'll go ahead and clean everything up with lacquer thinner. Make sure it's all dust free. Let that lacquer thinner dry really well. And then we'll mix up some epoxy and glue the scales on. I use a DevCon 5-minute epoxy, so your working time is quite short. I need to make sure your pins and everything fit very well and everything's all to your liking before you go ahead and do this process, because once you start, you're fairly well committed to it. And then I'll clamp that in there, and I usually let it sit for several hours at least. Even though it is a 5-minute epoxy, I just like to give it time before I start grinding on my pins and creating heat and stuff like that. And then once it's all fully cured, we will go ahead and take down the pins and start profiling the handles. And then with this knife being a fairly simple knife, I want just a very simple, clean, and elegant look. I didn't do a lot of heavy profiling on the handles. I rounded the edges over a little bit, and to do that I use a slack part of the belt when I have my hollow wheel on, and I've got a scalloped belt on there, and what that ensures is that the edges of the belt will not dig into the handle as you're shaping and stuff like that. So those scalloped belts are really great for finishing off handles. And with this knife, I pretty much did the entire thing with my belt grinder. I didn't do any hand finishing on this blade whatsoever. Sorry, on the handle portion. And I find that once I commit to using my belt grinder more and more, it's amazing the different ways you learn to use it, and it becomes such a versatile tool. Really like having a decent belt grinder in the shop. And here we have the finished product. Like I said, I just wanted a very simple, elegant, clean knife. There's not a lot of different angles. Just something that was almost plain, but well finished. Turned out quite nice. I'm really happy with this blade. Thanks for watching the video, guys. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, guys. Cheers.